Okay, welcome to this lesson on the League of Nations. This is part of section 2 of your Unit 1 course. Okay, League of Nations. When was it set up? What did it do? Who was involved in it? What was its kind of main purpose? And what problems and limitations did it face? So, the first kind of inkling that there was going to be a League of Nations came in January 1918. Now, for a long time before then, there had been talk across Europe about how can we prevent war, what can stop war happening. And one of the ideas that was out there was this kind of league of countries joining together in order to make so big a group that it made war unlikely in the future. Now, the first time it was actually talked about in regards to the 20th century was in January 1918. If we zoom in here now, really grainy picture, but it's the best we've got. Here in the centre is President Wilson of the USA giving a speech in January whilst war was still going on. And in this speech, he outlined the 14 points that he thought should be followed after the end of war. Now, as we said, once war's finished, and if we scroll over here, we'll see, so January 1918, the war is still going on. We're talking November by the time it finishes, so we've got a full year for the impact of these 14 points to be considered. So when we think about the 14 points, was Wilson saying them to try and encourage people to stop fighting? And that's one of the reasons why they're quite idealistic. So within this speech here, he gives out 14 different things that he thinks should happen. One of them being this idea that there should be a League of Nations that should join together to prevent fighting in the future. Now, because of the destruction of World War I, because of everything that had been happening in the countries that were involved, the idea of stopping war in the future was very, very popular. And so at this point, there was kind of a general goodwill towards the idea. And in 1919, it's actually set up, this League of Nations, with 44 founding members. Now, you can see from the map here that actually the League of Nations wasn't a set group of countries that stayed the same throughout its history. It was very, very fluid, so people moved in and out of it. You can see, if we look at like the dark blue, these are the only countries that started and stayed all the way until the end. We've got plenty of examples of countries that joined later and left, like Russia here, for example. We've got ideas of founding members that kind of were there at the start and then left before the end of it. We've got some in South America here, some European countries here, for example, Spain. We've also got countries that joined later and saw it through all the way till the end. And we've got some that kind of like didn't ever join. So pause the video here if you want to find out more about which countries were actually involved. So main countries that actually stayed all the way through really has got to be two main ones. We've got Britain and we've also got France. Those are really the two countries that actually saw this through for the entire time and were actually the most important. So we've got the British kind of leader of the League of Nations here, Eric Drummond. You can see in this photograph him. This is in London. He led it from 20 to 33, so kind of it's kind of key period here. If we look on the timeline, so that's leading all the way through to here. Now, in 1933, when he finishes, it's already begun to have a few problems. And the person that takes over from him, Joseph Avenel, this chap here with the specs, 33 to 40, actually, like there was been a secret agreement. British, French, there'd been an agreement that when the British leader, the British Permanent Secretary of the League of Nations, retired, it would automatically be a French kind of representative that took over. Now, Avenel was actually a kind of big fan of Hitler and Germany, and so much of what he did when he took over leadership of the League of Nations actually involved kind of policies that were beneficial towards Germany and towards countries like Italy that were kind of aligning themselves with that German axis of power through Hitler. So, we've had a quick look at the leaders there who are kind of in charge of it, but actually how did it function? What was the day-to-day running of the League of Nations like? So scroll up to the top here, we've got a couple of different sections to think about and to consider. If I just zoom in here for you. So 4 real sections to go through. Here, the main hub of the League of Nations, the Assembly. So the Assembly meets once a year. Now, you get one vote, all of the member nations actually take place in this, but it needs a unanimous decision in order to do anything at all. So you've got this once a year meeting where basically if you've got a dispute between countries, you get a chance to solve it. Now, we just know from what happened in World War I, we know from kind of what we know about politics and inter-country relationships, that a once a year forum is never going to be enough. And they kind of recognise that, and we've got the Council of the League as well, which is a committee that could also take major decisions. It was kind of random, actually, as to whether something came to the Council or to the Assembly. The council met 4 or 5 times a year, so it was more frequent, and that gave a kind of a better kind of chance for people to kind of get a dispute between countries sorted out. So another kind of section we've got as well is the Permanent Court of Justice. Now, you've got 15 judges. It's held at The Hague in the Netherlands. There's actually still a kind of international justice court there. And this kind of could rule, it could make a legal decision about a dispute that's going on between countries to try and resolve it without the need for war. But actually, it couldn't force countries to follow its decision. It had no power to do that. Now, on the other hand, the Secretariat is the kind of civil service of the League. It carries out the decisions, and it contains the kind of the worker bees who made sure that everything that was decided happened. So I think it would make sense to have a look at some of the actual kind of things that the League did, see it in action. So if we zoom in here, I've kind of labelled some of the conflicts that they tried to resolve. So have a look on the map here. I've outlined 5 different sections where the League got involved in disputes, and we can kind of see that for some of them it was quite successful, and for some of them it was less successful. So the first one we're going to have a look at here is Vilna. Vilna here, between Lithuania and Poland. Now, it had actually been claimed by both Lithuania and Poland. They said it belonged to their country. It had been given to Lithuania as part of the Versailles Peace settlement, but actually the majority of the population there were Polish, and in 1920 Poland actually invaded Lithuania and took control of Vilna. Now, technically that's an act of aggression. The League of Nations, very, very kind of like clear mandate to stop that kind of thing. They should have stopped that happening, but actually they weren't prepared to take action. They didn't want to get involved in this fight, and Britain and France actually let Poland keep Vilna. They wanted Poland as an ally, and Vilna stayed Polish, despite the fact it had been taken through an act of aggression. The next example, the next year, so 1921, Upper Silesia here. And again, Poland involved. You can see Poland in the middle here. Poland and Germany, though, this time. Upper Silesia disputed between the two of those. Now, at Versailles, it had been decided that actually this kind of should just have a vote and decide which way it should go between the two countries. The population there should have got to decide. So they had this vote, this plebiscite, and that was in favour of Germany. The majority of people in Upper Silesia wanted to be German, and so you would expect it to become German. In actual fact, the League decided to split the territory between the two countries, and that was accepted by those two countries. So a fairly successful mediation by the League of Nations there. So as compared to Vilna, which had been a bit of a disaster, this one kind of ended more kind of favourably. It was not popular within Germany, though, which is worth noting, and you know from the work we've done on Germany that would have been kind of taken very, very badly. The League was starting to kind of make a difference. It was starting to have an impact on what happened with disputes, and we could see another example there of it not going to conflict. And the same happened in the Åland Islands, which were disputed between Sweden and Finland. They both felt that they belonged to their country. Now, in this case, the League arbitrated again. They kind of went through the motions with this one. They went through, decided which kind of country should get them, and they decided they should go to Finland. Actually, both countries accepted the decision here as well. So another example of the League being successful, preventing a war. Okay, the next kind of major incident I want to talk about is in Corfu, a couple of years later in 1923. And this is really the first time that you begin to see cracks in the way the League of Nations operates. We didn't talk about it earlier, but actually the League didn't have its own standing army. It was kind of up to the countries that made up the League to make up the army. And what this meant in practice is that when a conflict kind of happened, when it got to the point where a country invaded another country, the countries would need to actually produce an army and go and get rid of that army that had gone there. And there was a massive reluctance, particularly from Britain and from France, to do that. In Corfu in 1923, a kind of a skirmish and argument between some Italian surveyors and some Greek soldiers leads to the Italian surveyors being killed. Italian leader, so Italy here next to Corfu, which is part of Greece, Italian leader Mussolini occupies Corfu. Now, Corfu, very nice island, we might associate it with holidays these days, but at the time, completely taken over by Mussolini and Italian troops, an act of aggression that Britain and France really had to deal with. They had to send people in, they had to make this kind of point that you can't invade countries just because you feel like it, but they did not want to. They didn't want to go and do that. So, what actually ended up happening was that the Greeks were forced to apologise to Mussolini and to pay compensation, and then the Italian troops left. So what we had here is a key member of the League of Nations, Italy, pushing its weight around, just bullying another country within the League of Nations, and Britain and France unable to actually kind of stand up to it. And this kind of really shows the limitations of the League of Nations. On the other hand, when Greece did something very similar and kind of got into a skirmish with Bulgaria, the League of Nations told them to get out, and they did. So we see the League of Nations effective against smaller countries, but really actually wasn't effective when it came to one of its own members and kind of forcing them to do what it wanted to. There's actually a great quote that we don't know exactly how accurate it is, but that apparently comes from Benito Mussolini, who's the Italian leader, saying, "The League is very well when sparrows shout, but no good at all when eagles fall out." But it wasn't all doom and gloom for the League of Nations. There are actually some kind of notable successes. I'm zoomed in here on this. This is a Nansen passport. And this is one of the areas where they did really well. So the League could have had special commissions that were set up that were run by it. One into slavery, looked at the issue of slavery and tried to make sure that it was abolished everywhere, even though it had already been made illegal. For example, they freed 200,000 slaves in Sierra Leone, made Ethiopia agree to end slavery so that they could join the League of Nations. So they had success with this. And after the First World War, there were 500,000 prisoners of war who needed to be returned to their homelands. There were millions of refugees who needed to be kind of taken home. And this is what the Nansen passport was set up to do, a really, really useful kind of piece of work. Another thing, the Mandates Commission, there were 14 territories that had been governed by the defeated powers and needed to be kind of either returned to kind of previous governance if they'd been free countries, or actually needed help ruling themselves, and kind of the League of Nations managed to do this as well. So there were kind of two key points here that we're going to finish on about kind of the lack of success of the League. Let's zoom in first on this cartoon, this famous cartoon, British, from 1920. Have a little look around, like doing your normal source analysis skills, kind of what can you see first of all. We've got a kind of bridge here, that's obviously going to be the part of it. It says, this League of Nations bridge designed by the President of the USA, we know that's Wilson now. Caption, the gap in the bridge. Here's Wilson, how do we know he's American? Well, Stars and Stripes, Uncle Sam imagery, all going to work for us. What's this here? The missing block from the bridge. It says here, Keystone. Keystone, the stone that's going to hold it all together. It's missing. America's not coming in. The message of the source was that without America, the League couldn't succeed. And that was a big part of it. I mean, not having America in there did mean that the League found it much more difficult to operate and could actually not really enforce its decisions. Another thing, though, from 1931, we start to see high-profile failures of the League. We've got Manchuria, the Manchuria crisis, and we've got Abyssinia, which involves Italy yet again. And then by 1939, of course, we know that World War II breaks out, which has got to be the ultimate failure of the League of Nations. So if we think about kind of when did the League of Nations become obvious it was going to fail, we're going to look at 1931 onwards and think about kind of how the Manchurian crisis and how Abyssinia affected them, and those will be coming up in the next video. So that is section 2.3, the League of Nations.